Welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're looking at a bunch of material you shared, excerpts, reporting, some commentary, all focused on, well, some pretty big shifts happening right now in Brazil.
Yeah, we're touching on the Supreme Federal Court, the STF, then the federal police, the PF, and of course, party politics. Always moving.
Exactly. And our mission here is simple. Cut through the headlines, pull out the key insights, the important nuggets from these specific sources, and basically give you a shortcut to understanding what's really going on underneath it all.
It's about connecting the dots between these different areas.
We'll be looking at some big upcoming legal decisions, some institutional challenges, and how political loyalties might be, well, realigning as we look ahead. Okay, let's get into it.
Sounds good. It's a really interesting mix of sources because, like you said, they touch different pillars, legal, security, political, all at once. Looking at the details together can reveal things you might miss otherwise.
Absolutely. So let's start with the STF, the Supreme Federal Court. Because the sources point to a major judgment coming up concerning social media regulation.
Right, and there's reporting from Daniela Lima specifically, suggesting a kind of consensus among the ministers.
A consensus that some kind of regulation is, quote, necessary.
And the reason given, according to that reporting, is the rise of these AI-generated deepfakes. You know, ultra-realistic videos making it super hard to know what's real anymore.
And the argument is framed around public safety, protecting people's lives, kids, families, basically saying this new tech needs new rules.
But the sources also say the specific rules, those are still under discussion. So agreement on the need, maybe, but not the how.
And there's this interesting detail mentioned about potential internal talks, ministers possibly meeting before the Wednesday session.
Yeah, to try and reach a middle ground. The reporting draws a parallel to how they supposedly worked out rules for police operations in Rio, kind of pre-negotiating.
Okay, but then we get the other side. Your sources include commentary from Ricardo Dias, and he's, let's just say, highly skeptical.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah.
He basically says the outcome's already baked in. You don't need to wait until tomorrow to know the result, is his quote.
He questions the whole premise, doesn't he, seeing it as a power grab?
He does. His take is quite blunt, he says. Always, it's this talk of protecting someone, to put it firmly, in the buttock. He thinks existing law, the Marco Civil Die Internet, is enough.
So, in his view, the Internet is regulated.
Yeah, he argues the STF just doesn't like the current rules and wants to impose its own version. He calls it the Marco Civil Die Toga, the judge's civil framework, essentially.
Implying they're legislating from the bench.
Exactly. And that leads him to question the whole process, that idea of ministers getting together beforehand. He asks, can they combine? They're going to combine before. Raising a transparency flag there.
The sources also mention ways this whole thing could get delayed, right?
Talk of a pedido de vista, a request for review. Possibly from Minister Nunes Marques, that could pause everything.
Or speculation about Minister Andre Mendonça taking a long time to vote, though Dias seems pretty dubious about how anyone would know that in advance.
Right. And there's another path mentioned, too, a different way to get some regulation quickly.
Ah, yes, the preliminary injunction, a liminart.
Requested by the Attorney General's office, the AGU, from Minister Dias Toffoli. And the specific reason cited for that request is interesting. Alleged INSS scams targeting retirees through paid social media ads.
Okay, wow. So right off the bat, two really different stories from the sources. One saying regulation is vital for safety against new threats like AI. The other calling it a judicial overreach, arguing the existing law works. What are the real stakes here based on this?
Well, it really gets to the heart of a huge question. Who gets to control information online? And how? It's not just abstract legal stuff. This directly impacts you, the listener. It could change what you see online, what platforms are liable for, how discussions happen.
So when Dias mentions the Marco Civil de Toga,
he's tapping into that bigger debate about who should make these rules. Is it the judiciary's job to create broad regulations like this, or should that come from Congress? And these legal tools, like a liminar focusing on INSS scams, they show how specific, urgent problems can lead to faster, targeted court action, even before the big overall judgment lands.
And the pedido de vista.
That just throws uncertainty to the mix. It means a delay, potentially a long one. So the outcome remains up in the air.
Okay, that clarifies the STF picture quite a bit. Let's shift gears now. Another institution highlighted in your sources, the federal police, the PF, and apparently they're facing some serious money problems.
Yes, and this is critical because the PF is, well, the key federal investigative body Their ability to function is fundamental.
There's a CNN Brazil report cited saying the PF is dealing with major budget cuts. And crucially, long delays in paying per diems.
How long?
Up to 2 months, according to the report. 2 months waiting for expense money.
Wow. And the impact.
The report says the PF is basically threatening to slow down or even paralyze major operations because of this.
Which operations?
They mention complex crimes, think drug trafficking, corruption, organized crime, the big stuff. And the sources include a note from the PF Delegates Association.
The police chiefs union, essentially.
Right, complaining about the cuts and delays and warning that operations needing travel might just stop unless the per diems get paid up front.
That really brings it home. I mean, if agents can't afford hotels or food when they're out on a case, those investigations just grind to a halt.
And guess who has commentary on this too?
Let me guess. Ricardo Diaz.
You got it. With his usual sarcasm, he kind of suggests this financial squeeze is maybe convenient?
Convenient for whom?
For letting certain investigations stall, maybe those INSS scams we just talked about, or cases involving, powerful politicians.
Ah, so he's drawing a connection there.
Yeah. His point seems to be that there's never money for gas or per diems when it involves investigating, say, important people, but plenty of resources to go after. In his words, some zay money, some nobody.
Implying a double standard in resource allocation. It could be seen as political, even if it's presented as just bureaucratic budget issues.
It definitely makes you wonder about priorities when things get tight. So what's the bigger picture here? Why is this PF funding issue so important?
Well, look, the PF handles the really complex federal crimes, often state or even international. Think major corruption scandals, large drug networks. These investigations require resources, travel, surveillance, long periods away from home base. Per diems aren't a luxury. They're essential operating funds.
So if they're genuinely squeezed, like the reports say,
the real-world impact could be huge. Fewer successful investigations into serious crime, potential impunity for corruption or organized crime figures. It fundamentally weakens the state's ability to enforce federal law. And when Diaz links it, even sarcastically, to politically sensitive cases, he's pointing out how something as mundane as expense reports can actually intersect with really high stakes politics.
It shows how practical issues can have these massive ripple effects. Okay, let's pivot one last time to the final theme in your sources, shifts in the political landscape, party politics.
Right, moving from institutions to the political actors themselves, specifically looking at Paulinho da Força and his party, Solidariedade.
Yeah, there's reporting from Jovem Pan News indicating he, as party president, has announced Solidariedade is leaving Lula's government base.
That's a clear move. They're explicitly saying no support for Lula, no support for any PT candidate in 2026.
Pretty unambiguous. And the reasons they give.
According to the report, they're citing a lack of dialogue with the government. They specifically name Lula and Finance Minister Fernando Haddad. Paulinho da Força apparently described the administration as rudderless.
Strong words. And what are their plans now?
The report says they're aiming to form a new federation. The PRD party is mentioned as a potential partner, and the goal, to build a center-right candidacy for president.
Interesting. And they even floated a name, didn't they?
Yes, Governor Tarcísio de Freitas mentioned as a possibility they might support within that kind of project.
And they also made a point of saying they won't back extremists, either left or right, trying to carve out that middle ground.
So how big a deal is this departure? Solidariedade isn't a giant party, but look, NEPs breaking off the government's coalition signals potential weakness, or at least fragmentation. It definitely shows that parties are already actively positioning for 2026. The game is already underway.
And this center-right path they're talking about, what does that signify in Brazil today?
Well, in the context of polarization we often see discussed, it represents an effort to create another option, something different from the current left-leaning government, and also distinct from candidates seen as further to the right. It's a play for voters who might be tired of the extremes.
So why should you, the listener, pay attention to this?
Because these kinds of shifts matter. Parties changing sides, forming new alliances. It changes the political map. It affects who might run, what policies get debated, and ultimately the choices you'll face in the next election. It shows the ground is definitely shifting. New possibilities, maybe new challenges are bubbling up.
Okay, So let's try and pull these threads together from the sources we've covered. We've got this intense debate around regulating social media, who controls information, really. Then, the very real, practical problems facing the federal police, potentially hampering their ability to act due to reported money issues. And finally, these clear shifts in the political arena, with parties like Solidarity breaking away and looking towards 2026.
Yeah, when you look at them together, as presented in these sources, you get this snapshot. Different kinds of pressure legal, institutional capacity, political strategy, all interacting. It really shows how intertwined these things are.
Absolutely. So just thinking about the specific material we discussed today, this reported push for more social media control, the financial constraints hitting the police, and political parties already maneuvering for the next election, here's something to chew on.
Go on.
How might these three things, controlling information flow, the actual capacity of law enforcement, and these shifting political alliances, how might they bump up against each other and potentially reshape the balance of power, and maybe even who gets access to what information in Brazil over the next few years?
That's quite a thought. Definitely something to mull over as you keep following the story.